let's start again. I am Quarter. Read my words and be my friend. Father commands me to record the truth of history, so that readers will learn from those who went before. That's actually a deep thought if you think about that for a second. Therefore, I give each of my 7 sons one of these self-engraving, history-recording clay walls. Okay, the next slide. By the way, it's called the Neverhood Chronicles Preamble. This wall automatically records the activity in this world, and in any other world containing one of the other walls. Behold, anyone who tampers with the records on these walls will be considered the enemy of Father. I will not like you much, either. This wall is given by Father. It will teach you to acquire wisdom, integrity, and skills for solving problems. In each of our lives, we must make decisions. When these times come, be ready to make the right choices. Continue in what you know is true, though truth is often hard to see. These walls may hold the only truths you will know. Quarter. Well, that was interesting. Then we have this image of a huge, I guess, stone circle on a pylon that is sunk inside a spherical planet. Father. What does the Father What does the Father have to say? Father is a kind being whom no one has ever seen, like a god. Father is beyond our comprehension. All folks know is that he was here before there ever was a here. He is happy and enjoys existing. He is said to be great and powerful, and as far as anyone knows, there was no one before him. He is from the other side. No one has ever been to the other side, but it is supposed to be a great place where there is peace without death. Quarter. Quarter is the only being Father has ever made. He, like the God's Son, he has been a good friend of Father's for many eons. Quarter is the official go-between for all beings and Father. Since he himself is a being made by Father, not much can be learned about Father by looking at Quarter. But if anything is known to anyone about Father, Quarter revealed it. Quarter forged 7 crowns for 7 beings he created for Father to pour his approval on. This is quite an important sentence, that Quarter forged 7 crowns for 7 beings he created for Father to pour his approval on. Quarter left the comfort of Father's presence to pioneer a new world where his beings could make their own place in order to emphasize with Quarter. It's starting to get interesting. And here goes Ogdilla. Ogdilla. Quarter made Ogdilla as a kind of test subject. He gave Ogdilla a crown, although he did not have a head to set the crown on. Ogdilla is a mass of blue gas that is barely self-aware. It is said that Ogdilla is the spirit of adventure, since on the day he was made, he left Quarter's homeland traveling in a straight line without stopping. He has picked up so many particles from space, which have made a happy home for themselves on Ogdilla's back. Ogdilla is now 1,000,000 times the size he was when Quarter made him, and his inhabitants include the Oh no, he's calling me again. Sorry, I will cut that out. Ogdilla is now 1,000,000 times the size he was when Quarter made him, and his inhabitants include the specks of rhyolite. The specks of rhyolite were in constant conflict with the specks of rod. The specks of rod cultivated food on Ogdilla's back using their own spit. The specks of rhyolite had no spit, but occupied most of the surface of Ogdilla. The specks of rhyolite were disgusted by all the spitting that the specks of rod did, and they did not like stepping in it either. The strife between the specks of rhyolite and the specks of rod carried on for centuries. The conflict was never physically violent, but there was much whining, taunting, heated sneering, upheavals, and so on. This period is known as the Ubla Senchte Hocht, or the 3 millennia of conflict, although it was really more like 2.5. During the Ubla Senchte Hocht, an incident happened that at once made all the specks forget their animosity and at the same time exacerbated the conflict even more. In the 8th month of the 27th day, during the 11th year of the 1st century of the 2nd millennium, one of the Ubla Senchte Hocht, the specks of rhyolite woke up to find a strange being of gigantic size asleep in Scrunchy Park. There was a pond by his head where he had drooled while he slept. A crowd of specks gathered around the Titan it's really catching your attention as the morning hours went by. The larger crowd grew, the more the specks talked among themselves. The hubbub finally became so loud that the giant awoke and sat up. The giant showed his great teeth and growled at them from deep within his huge body. The specks fed him for fear of being eaten alive. The giant could easily have thrown 3 or 4 of them into his mouth at once. He was very bizarre looking. Even for a gianty, he was like nothing they had ever seen before. His had a ring of flesh on it that started almost at the very top when looped down and joined the head again at the jaw. 3 specks, one on top of the other, could have stood up. I'm sorry for the stuttering, but it is hard to read, and also my English is not very good and fluent. 3 specks, one on top of the other, could have stood up inside the ring. He had huge lips with which he covered his enormous teeth, while the specks had no lips at all. Above the lips, almost to the top of the face, were 2 ball-shaped things that had 1 dot within each of them. The giant seemed to use them to observe things, since the dots moved and pointed at whoever was speaking to him. His torso was short for his size, while his legs were extremely long. Out of his chest stuck 3 spiked horns. 4 days upon end, the specks tried to speak to the giant to find out if he was friend or foe, to no avail. His form of speech sounded too low down, deep, and loud. It reminded them too much of the rumbling growl that came from deep within his body. The specks did not like it, and they did not understand it. They could not even tell where one syllable ended and the next began, and comprehending sentences was totally impossible. To avoid hearing him speak, the specks fed him constantly. The specks of Rhyolnate did not keep a guard posted where the giant was staying. They could never have overpowered him. In any case, the giant never threatened them. King Rhyolnate had in mind to win over the giant's confidence so that he might be employed to stomp on the specks of Rod. King Rhyolnate often went to Scrunchy Park to speak to the giant. He wanted to impress the giant, so he had the best acrobats from the Rhyolnate circus come visit him. The king commanded the unicyclist to do loop-de-loops inside the ring on the giant's head, while a high driver did trick dives off his huge lips into a barrel of water at the giant's feet. During these demonstrations of the circus performer's expertise, the giant did nothing but stand still and smile. Even while there were trapeze artists swinging from the three spikes that stuck out from his chest, the giant stood like a stone sculpture with a silly grin on his face. King Rhyolnate redoubled his efforts to continue to try to communicate with the giant. Once he saw that the giant would not harm the circus performers as they climbed and swung upon his body. Day after day, the king came out to where the giant was to try again to communicate his desire for the giant to walk over and stomp on the specks of Rod. The giant smiled a lot at the king. He nodded his head when the king nodded his head. He shook his head when the king shook his head. When King Rhyolnate slapped his own forehead, the giant slapped his own forehead. When the king mimed walking and pointed in the direction of the kingdom of Rod, the giant stood up and did a dance. So, what will happen next? King Rhyolnate was furious. While the giant was still dancing, the king ordered all the specks of Rhyolnate to throw things at him. Since they were feeding the giant all the time, the only stuff they had at hand was food, so they threw that at him. The giant tried to eat as much of the food thrown at him as possible, but he could not keep up with the furious pace with which the specks were throwing it at him. He turned and walked away from them and headed in the direction of the kingdom of Rod. Since the specks of Rhyolnate had thrown so much food at the giant, no matter where he turned, he stepped into it. With each step, more and more and more food gunged up on the bottom of his feet. The specks of Rhyolnate cheered and clapped and jumped up and down when the giant continued in the direction of Rod. The giant turned back to look at the specks, so they stopped their cheering and got ready to throw more food. But the giant did not come back. He continued on the way he was headed towards the kingdom of Rod. So the specks of Rhyolnate had a great celebration. They hoped that as soon as the giant arrived in the kingdom of Rod, he would smoosh the specks of Rod, who were such a bother to the kingdom of Rhyolnate. King Rhyolnate gave a rousing speech. "Well, that's that for the great giant. I suppose we owe the debt of thanks to the goofy colossus, for he will shortly be sleeping on the specks of Rod and making so much mush of them. His immense foot will crush our ancient foe in an instant. Squashed beneath his mammoth bulk, those unspeakable wretches will be reduced to the vile scum that they have always represented. We are now delivered forever from their constant whining, taunting, and hectoring. That feeble-minded titan is our national hero, a doltish whopper. He shall be the greatest of all figures in the history of Rhyolnate." I will now save the game and continue in the next episode as I have to refresh my voice. Hello and welcome back to the next podcast episode. It's not podcast, but I will be now reading the rest of the Hall of Records and then playing the game after that. So if you would like to see the gameplay, the remastered gameplay, which I'll be providing thanks to interpolation and upscaling, just skip this episode. But if you care about lore, or if you like my voice and would like to hear me reading the rest of this whole, although I introduce some stuttering and other noises into it. I'm not a professional reader and my English is very bad, so if you don't mind, you can listen to this even with the video closed. If you do mind or don't want to hear the rest of the story, or you only care about the gameplay, just skip this episode. And well, let's get back into it. Let's start off right where we have left before. The king, Rylnate, gave a rousing speech. We have already read that. The next slide is: there is none equal to his that is the continuation of his speech from the last episode. There is none equal to his block-headed enormity on all of Ogdilla, but he did finally come through for us. A suspendously dumb gargantua, it is well, nevertheless, that we are rid of him. And I suppose we ought to be thankful that a half-witted behemoth did not stomp on us too. I cannot think of any reason why he would come back here. Can you? Meanwhile, the specks of Rod heard the giant before they saw him. His every step made a hollow drum sound on the debris-covered surface of Ogdilla. They gathered into frightened groups, becoming more and more agitated as the blooming steps grew ever louder. Finally they saw him. They saw his big ring head, his big lips, and the spikes sticking out of his chest. So perhaps the last picture was Ogdilla. But what most impressed them were his feet. Actually, what most impressed them was what they saw stuck to the bottom of his feet. All that foot that he had stepped on looked disgusting, but the specks of Rot did not know that it was foot. The specks stood in stunned silence. They knew that the giant had come from the direction of the kingdom of Rylnate. Their imaginations took over from there. The specks of Rot were convinced. Somebody is writing to me, not now. Just put this on silent. The specks of Rot were convinced that the giant had stomped on the specks of Rylnate and made mush of them. As the giants got closer and closer, word went through the crowd that the giant had finished off the specks of Rylnate and was now coming to their kingdom to stomp on them. Some of the specks ran away screaming, but most stood still, knowing they could not outrun the fearsome giant's feet. Then one specks of the Rot started clapping. At first, the specks next to him thought he was crazy, but then they started clapping too. Soon a small group was clapping, then most of the crowd was clapping and cheering and jumping up and down as the giant approached. They had figured that if the giant fought, they were glad that the specks of Rylnate had been stomped to pudding, then he might spare them and consent to be their hero. When the giant reached the front of the crowd, they whooped and hollered for a few minutes more. Then the crowd parted and the King Rot made his way through to the front. There, before his people at the giant's feet, he made a speech. "Oh, great giant, thank you mighty colossal allied thing, for stepping on the specks of Rhyolnate and making so much mush of them. Your immense foot has crushed our ancient foe in an instant. Squashed beneath your mammoth bulk, these unspeakable hideous idiots, have been reduced to the evil scum that they have always represented. We are now delivered forever from their constant whining, taunting, and bantering. You, magnificent Titan, are our national hero. O necromaniacal whopper, you shall be the greatest of all figures in the history of Rod. There is none equal to your fabulous enormity on all of Ogdilla. You, tremendous Gargantua, shall be second only to myself, unless, of course, you would rather be number one. By the way, we thank you, phenomenal behemoth, so very much for not stomping on us too. I can only offer our humble kingdom to you, amazing monstrosity, as compensation for the wonderful deed you have accomplished today. It is not a kingdom worthy of your monumental grandiosity, of course. You won't like it much. You will probably not like anything we offer you, since it is all tiny compared to your gigantean size. But of course, anything we have is yours, but I don't know what you would do with it. I say, do you understand me? The giant smiled at the specks of Rod, who smiled back until he spoke to them. To the specks, his voice sounded slow and deep and slurred. They looked at each other and shrugged their shoulders. The specks of Rod decided to go back to what they were each doing before the giant arrived as they left. They kept looking over their shoulders. They kept looking over their shoulders to make sure the giant was not lifting one of his big feet to stomp on them. He did not move from where he stood and maintained his smile until they were out of sight. The next day the giant was right where the specks of Rod had left him, only he was sitting. So the specks went about their daily chores, and occasionally they would look over their shoulders at the giant just to make sure he had not stood up. This did not change for several days. Finally, the giant got up and started following some specks around. He seemed to be watching them as they went about their everyday tasks. He still smiled as he watched them, but not as much. Day after day, month after month, season after season, he watched them tending their fields from planting to harvest. At harvest time, many specks noticed how much thinner the giant looked, and how little he smiled as compared to when he had first arrived in the kingdom of Rod. As they talked about it, they realized no one had seen him eat while he had been there. Some of the specks got together and brought food to the giant. When he saw that they had brought some food to him, the giant looked horrified. He got up and ran off far away from the kingdoms of Rod and Rhyolnate. There is no official record of when the giant was seen last or who saw him, but a few specks from both kingdoms insist that they saw the giant ascending into the heavens early one morning, a few years after he ran away from the kingdom of Rod. Obvious reference here. About the time that the giant ran off, spies from the kingdom of Rhyolnate came to the kingdom of Rod and saw that the specks of Rod were not obliterated. They noticed that their enemies were not even bruised a little. This report went back to King Rhyolnate, who was shocked and upset that once again the specks of Rod had foiled his own speck kingdom. He ordered a delegation to go to the kingdom of Rod and meet with a delegation of the specks of Rod When the delegation of Rhyalnate arrived at the rod, there was much shock and agitation. "You are supposed to be squashed," said the representative of Rhyalnate. "Well, you are supposed to be squished," said the representative of Rod. Tensions rose, and accusations flew. Each side blamed the other for making their king's most famous speech a pack of lies. The delegations gave messages to each other to take back to their respective kings about how there could never be peace between the two kingdoms. As they left the meeting, they all thumbed their noses at each other. The Ubla Senchthehocht was back in full swing. King Rhyalnate grew tired of the thousands of years of bickering between his specs and King Rod's specs. In a desperate move to bring about a day of peace, he asked for a secret meeting with King Rod at the center of Ogdilla. In the 34th month, on the second day, during the 89th year of the 5th century of the 3rd millennium of the Ubla Senchthehocht, the kings met. The two kings reasoned for 2 weeks, trying solutions that were fair for both kingdoms, but to no avail. Meanwhile, Ogdilla himself had grown so tired of the angst he felt on his back that he spread all of the specks of Rod to one half of his back, and the specks of Rhyalnate to the other half of his back. In a violent quake, Ogdilla split into two beings, which floated independently from each other. The only problem was that King Rod ended up on the half of the back with the specks of Rhyalnate, and King Rhyalnate found himself on the half of Ogdilla with the specks of Rod. King Rhyalnate was at first mistaken by the specks of Rod as King Rod, but he quickly corrected the specks of Rod, announcing that he was King Rhyalnate. The specks of Rod immediately cut him into tiny pieces and fed him to their young. King Rod, however, told the specks of Rhyalnate that he was indeed their king, and since few specks of Rhyalnate had ever seen their own king, they believed him. Eventually, King Rod had the specks of Rhyalnate build him a large castle, which housed his children, who were half speck of Rod and half speck of Rhyalnate. King Rod, posing as King Rhyalnate, lived to see his speck harmoniously blend where it was previously thought impossible. The specks of Rhyalnate did not cultivate food on Ogdilla's back using their own spit like the specks of Rod. Instead, they rubbed their heads on the fine, hairy grass-like particles that had attached themselves to cover the Rhyalnate portion of Ogdilla's back. The rubbing caused static charges to build and build until small arcs of lightning flashed off of the specks' heads. Ogdilla's blue gas in the immediate area of the arcs of lightning reacted by turning into bite-sized cubes of lime-flavored finger snacks. This was the sole source of food for the specks of Rhyalnate. Every 247 days, this was 1 year for the specks of Rhyalnate, chosen arbitrary because they did not have seasons, the specks had their annual feast, which was called the Philanch per Jungai, Philanch per Jungai. The great day began with the concert of rubbing, where the entire population of Rhyalnate, young and old alike, rubbed their heads on the hairy particles until they collapsed exhausted, unable to lift a limb. About 3 hours after this frenzy, some specks regained enough strength to shakingly pull themselves upright. Then the male specks began the harvest of cubes while the female specs prepared gastronomic delights such as cube fondue, cube salad, cube roast, cube soup, cube and cube on a stick. For the kids, of course. Cube paste, cube fillet, cube pile, cube relish, cube stuffing, blackened cube, cube kebabs, cube sherbet, and so on and so on and so on. Cube on the rocks for the adults, steamed cube, smoked cube, and of course Susan's cube bubble loaf. Okay. While the delicious someone's writing. Okay. While the delicious smells of cube cookery were filling the air, those who were not busy found time to participate in fun Philange per Jungai games like "Come over here! Hey, you just bumped my friend's elbow. Are you just going to stand there? And this is my bucket." The day culminated with the Philange per Jungai dance, which they performed lying on their backs with their feet as high in the air as they could possibly get them. First prize going to the dancers with their feet highest up. King Rod, whom the specs of Ryle Nate thought was King Ryle Nate, used the occasion of Philange per Jungai to campaign for re-election since 12 days after the picnic was polling day. The specs voted every year, but they only had two choices: King Rod Green ballot or King Rod Purple ballot. Either way, King Rod got re-elected. Oh, what a fitting idea. Oh, this is Ogdilla, isn't it? Well, let's read further. Philange per Jungai was the specs of Ryle Nate Forgotten Day of Atonement. They knew that in their past there was a defined day set aside as a day of atonement, but it was forgotten before King Rod ever took over the position of King Ryle Nate. At least they knew there once was a day of atonement, but the specs could not remember what they need atonement for. After King Rod took the throne, a spec named Hephamet, during the demolition of a shoe foundry, found a vague historical reference to a day of atonement called the Philange per Jungai. The king's advisors advised the king to declare a new Philange per Jungai and to have the marketing department think of some fun things to do on it. No one could think of anything they needed atonement for, so the day is mostly remembered for the annual feast or for the dancing thing. The specs of Ryle Nate determined when one day was over and a new day had begun by having the day determiner hold the determiner stone out of her side at arm's length. When the this is hard for my tongue to and mouth to process, sorry. When that day's day determiner could no longer hold their arm up, the day was declared done, and the next day determiner took up the stone. Being day determiner was a prestigious honor, but no she-spec was allowed to do it more than once a year. Ryle Nate specs merit in threes, two grooms and a department thing. What? I skipped something. Oh, two brooms and a bride, of course. Or two brides and a groom. Just by groups of three. In either case, the spouse with the two counterspouses had to alternate every day, being spouse to one and then the next day to the other. Each spec year, the sequence is renewed, starting with the spouse who was shorted by one day the previous year. The marriage ceremony of Royal Nate was short and simple. The three specks went before the king on the assigned day of their marriage appointment. Each stated their vows, which consisted only of a promise to abide by the custom of spouse alternating and a promise to never get ugly. The vows were repeated in this way. The king said to each speck in turn, "Do you, blah blah, promise to never get ugly?" To which each responded in turn, "I do." Then, in the case of one groom and two brides, for example, the king said to the groom speck, "Repeat after me. I, blah blah, take you, blah blah, to be one of my wedded wives, and you, blah blah, to be the other of my wedded wives." Annulment usually stemmed from one of the two brides or one of the two grooms, in the case of one bride and two grooms, feeling slighted because he or she was not the first one named in the vow. Divorce usually stemmed from one spouse being cheated out of his or, of his or her fair share of marriage. Days on leap year, when an extra day went to the spouse, who then renewed the New Year sequence. And that's all for the chapter of Ogdilla, I believe. Then comes a more interesting chapter called Bert, or Bert if you are an English speaker. Bert. Quarter made his next being with a form closer to his own. He attempted to duplicate himself, but because he was not as good of a man-builder as father, the being was not quite a perfect duplicate. Oh, Quarter duplicated himself. Bert was given powers of speech and reason, his duplicate, I suppose, but he could not grasp that he was different from Quarter. He thought he was Quarter and instantly made 7 of his own crowns and started making his own people in his own image. Because Bert was an even worse being maker than Quarter, each generation looked worse and worse. By the last generation, Bert's beings were not even alive, they just looked like blobs of meat. Oh, disgusting and horrifying. The lineage, I have no idea how it's pronounced correctly, the lineage of Bert, empowered by Quarter to create Bert, believing that he himself was Quarter, beget another Bert. This second Bert beget Bert, a weak attempt at a Bert, but with a speech impediment. Bert was Bert instead Bert, was a wise being, the most wise of all, it has been said, although no one knows exactly who said that, but it stuck. He did not write down any of his wisdom, but his son, Brid-Brack, the literal transcribed Bradbat's lectures. Okay. No, here. Oh no. Lineage of Bert. And then the killer be killed, the dancing man. Oh, that's what he has written. The killer be killed, the dancing man stilled. When bees of plenty sting my heart many, I emaciate, thinner. Found are the 3 ways of Babylon. First is fear. It eats itself like a snake down a hill and finds nourishment there. The bigger it gets, the more it eats until it is everywhere. Second, greed. Unlike fear, it shrinks until the snake is something small and despicable, smelling like a torch when mixed with hair. Third, vanity. Is the snake thinking he has strong legs that can jump the stream? He floats belly up when caught in the snare. I will share with you my comings and goings if you will listen. You will join me on these journeys if you hasten. We will perish if you do not. Bradbad, having no point of reference but himself, begat Bridebrack, the literal. Who begat Bigback? Bigback was thin for his age, and his peers mocked him for the purple and green skin splotches that covered his body. Once a large crowd of descendants of Bert had formed, poor Bigback was made to sit in the back. What? Bigback was thin for his age, and his peer mocked him for the purple and green skin splotches that covered his body. That is the end. And it continues with once a large crowd of descendants of Bert had formed, poor Bigback was made to sit in the back. He tried to hide his sadness by pretending to enjoy the back of the crowd. It was there that he met the rest of the back of the crowd. They were pitiful beings suffering from physical maladies almost as bad as his splotches. A distant cousin named Highface offered to stand behind Bigback, so that it would seem like he was not in the absolute back of the crowd. But Bigback chose to emulate the cruelty of the rest of the group by pointing out Highface's abnormality, a tiny second head growing from his palm. He sang a song about a thing with a thing hiding in its palm. Everyone laughed at Highface for a while and praised Bigback for his entertaining and funny verse. Highface confronted Bigback regarding this display of cruelty, but Bigback sang the song again until Highface ran home crying. The crowd acknowledged that Bigback was witty, but they still could not let him go to the front of the crowd because of those awful splotches. This gave Bigback an idea. One morning, Bigback went to great lengths to hide his splotches. Using some dust, he coated himself until finally his peers found him beautiful. They quickly escorted him to the front of the crowd, where he was commanded to write more songs about the beings in the back of the crowd. Yeah, it's a satire at its best. It's starting to not be funny anymore. It's just so dark satire that I'm not even laughing. It's pretty on point. Well, surely it is a whole of truths. Let's continue. Bigback wrote songs of cruelty and prejudice about them all. All, that is, except for one in the back row. He hoped that the front of the crowd would not notice that he was intentionally overlooking his brother, Lytle, who was retarded and therefore the most back of the whole back row. But alas, someone noticed. "Now, Bigback, let us have a song about Lytle," the crowd screamed. They figured that Bigback was saving a song about Lytle until the end, since it would be the funniest and easiest to write given the subject matter. Bigback looked across the crowd at Lytle, who could only stare at the ground. Lytle was pitiful in his brother's sight, and Bigback hated him for not being perfect. Bigback walked over to his brother, who was drooling and looking very stupid. Lytle recognized his brother and decided to hug him hard the way he always had. Lytle reached out and hugged Bigback, saying, "Lyle like Bix." I just need to back up my my sound files and video files. Okay, sound files and video files are backed up. Now let's continue reading. The crowd roared with laughter at Lytle. They found his audacity to touch someone from the front row typical of his level of stupidity. Embarrassed, Big Back threw Lytle to the ground and called him an animal. Lytle was shocked and began to cry. Big Back looked down at his drool-covered arms. The drool had wiped away some of his dust covering, exposing the horrible, hated splotches. Big Back openly wept face down on the ground. Lytle crawled over to him and held him. The crowd was uncomfortable. No one knew what to do. Just then, Big Back wiped his eyes and announced, "I have a song about the pitiful members of the back of the crowd." Those in back of the crowd figured that this would be the most degrading song yet. The front of the crowd cheered. Lytle drooled. Big Back sang in a voice so beautiful that to this day no song has been written to compare. This is what he sang. "In this life I have found one thing." Or perhaps, "In this life I have found one thing." It is pity incarnate of which I sing. You have been told about the back of the crowd, and I repeat it plenty loud. What does he repeat? That they are animals to be excused, as hapless freaks which we shall use as ladder rungs for our speedy ascent to the front of the crowd, where we will invent a strict system of attractive and not on which side of the net will you be caught. Align me please with the crowd's back. The front can, for what I care, go to heck, with their own standards based on their small group. If given the choice between accepting many or few, I will love the different and accept the whole crowd. I will sing of my world long and loud. In my world, I say, that we, the low, be tall, and so Brother Lytle is greatest of all. The entire crowd fell silent as Big Back walked over to his brother and held him. He whispered in Lytle's ear, "I'm sorry I have been a big fool." Lytle still just drooled. Some members of the crowd heeded Big Back's song and embraced the entire crowd. Others did not and made it their full-time concern to re-establish the lines between the front and back of the crowd. Big Back lived a happy life. He wed Phyllis, a demure little lady, also from the back of the crowd. He begat Macmock, which means low is high. Macmock begat Macmac, who begat Macmac, who begat Macmac, who begat Macmac, who fashioned a two-sided being which included both genders, male and female, one on either side. It was a colossal being named Mamur, who was very proud indeed. It considered itself absolutely complete, lacking nothing and independent even from its creator Macmac. Macmac could not stand for such conceit, so he made a huge crowbar with which he pried the being into two parts, a male being named Mean and a female being named Mavi. It took all of Macmac's strength to pry the two halves apart, and when Mamur finally split, it sent the crowbar hurtling out into space. As soon as the two half-beings saw that they were no longer a singular whole, they started trying to put themselves back together. Oh, it's starting to be again, and they have been trying to put themselves back together ever since. Mamur, or Mean and Mavi, then begat Momet, and the sons of Momet were Momach and Marzim and Motap and Mnek, and the sons of Mo'mach, and so on and so on. I won't be reading all of this. Now Medit became the father of Moremini, who became a mighty florist in his town. He was a mighty florist before Quota. Therefore it is said, like Moremin, a mighty florist before Quota. And the beginning of his kingdom consisted of Daisy World and Rosebud and Tulip Crime in the land of Ranish. From that land he went forth into Milpitas and built Hwoni and Tut and Hoot and Resisin between Hwoni and Titi. That is the great city. And Moremin, I'm starting to believe that the developers who have written this whole of records were imagining someone might one day read the whole, and so they made it intentionally hard to read. And Mormin became the father of Miduel and Mimena and Mibahel and Mihutfan and Mizurthep and Mihusek, from which came the peons, and Mirothpek and Mixedmeth, the evil twins. And Mizerthep became the father of Moses, his firstborn, and Methbeth, and the Quergenites, and the Jojo man, and the Philodendrites, and the Shrub people, and the Clay Wanters, and the Resincinities, and the Brith, and the Manachite, and afterward the families of the Manachite were spread abroad, and the territory of the Manachite extended from Nodis as you go toward Modoc, Delano, and Truckee, and Chester, and Alturas as far as Lake Almanor. So these were the sons of Momet, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. Modis then begat Memin, who decided to wear a purple hood instead of a crown. Memin begat Meni, who liked hoods a lot but hated his father's purple hoodie. So in rebellion, he went back to the crown-wearing tradition of previous generations. This gesture pleaded Quater so much that Mani was simply caught up into the presence of Quater to live forever in peace with father, but not before he was able to create a poor likeness of himself, Mani, who begat Waini, who begat Fo G, the founder of the famous Fwaan nation, who begat Fepet, who begat Fep-P, who begat Fe, who liked to sing loving songs for his sons. He sang by expelling air from between 5 flaps of flesh on his back. Fe sang this way, Fe sang this way as a sincere gesture of love for his many sons, but the perpetual honking and flapping of his songs echoed up to the ears of Quater, who, after many years of tolerance, could finally take it no more. Quater smote Fe with a bolt of energy so intense that nobody ever found a trace of his body. Fe was destroyed in the prime of his life, but not before he was able to create 13 sons. Fe's 13 sons were Klau, Klav, Klau, Klimt, Kleft, Klek, Klink, and 5 sons, all of whom Fe named Kloppen Homwinwitz, because he could not think of another name until the birth of his last son, Kli. In the four legends are the stories of Fe and his 13 sons. Fe's favorite son was named Kli, meaning give me more like this one. Fe often had his sons watch the Fwokettle herd in an attempt to teach them the value of hard work and the responsibility of caring for the herd. Fwokettle had three genders: female, he-male, and free-male. Free males had the gender characteristics of all three genders. Oh god. When the females were nursing, they exuded four jerkins from their hide. Four jerkins were the staple of the 4A diet. Klee was the next screen. Klee was the youngest of 4 sons, yet he was also the most responsible, and he was the only one who listened when Fe spoke to his sons the legends Fep P had told him of Father and Quarter. The other sons spent most of their time listening to their father's songs, but avoiding work, dreaming of ways to spend their inheritance as soon as their father died. On the other hand, Klee spent his time tending the family herd of Fwokettle with such care that many thought it was his own herd. It was the largest herd of Fwokettle in the nation of Woa, next to the emperor's own herds, and Fe certainly appreciated Klee's care. To show his appreciation, he slaughtered his finest forecalf and had the hide made into a fine pair of shorts for Klee. Fe's other sons considered Klee an obstacle to their fun, so they started spending a portion of their time planning ways to get rid of him. When Klee was out herding the Fwokettle with his brothers, he would often bring back a bad report to his father of how the other sons abused the herd, and often secretly sold 4 jerkins for their own profit. Klee boldly told his brothers that while they were dreaming up ways to avoid work, he was dreaming of being emperor of Fwaa. This got on their nerves, and after much plotting, they did finally came up with a plan to get rid of Klee. When he came out to the plains of Choppen to check up on them, they grabbed him and sewed him and his fine shorts to the back of a Fwabble. It's getting really gruesome. The brothers then traded Klee and the Fwabble to some Choppen pops for some stewed pots. They took these back to Fe and explained that Klee had been trampled in a Fwa stampede, and that the pots were all that was left of their brother. Fe mourned for 88 years the death of his favorite son Klee. Meanwhile, the Choppenpops, never noticing Klee soon to the back of their new Fwabble, traded it to the emperor's herdsman for a pack of Gaza smokes. Now an emperor likes a clean herd of Fwokettle, so his herdsmen scrubbed the Fwokettle daily. While they were scrubbing the new Fwabble that Klee was soon to, they noticed him crying out and begging to be able to be released. The herdsman released Klee to the custody of Portenchipa, the emperor's bodyguard. Portenchipa made Klee his butler, and Klee took on the responsibility much as he did with his father's herd of Fwokettle. Portenchipa was not home much, with all the responsibilities of his own job, but when he was home, he did not fail to notice Klee's meticulous care of the house and household matters. He actually did a better job than Portenchipa would have done himself. Portenchipa would have been jealous, but he enjoyed the spare time too much. In these days, each time Portenchipa had been out on one of his many trips away from home with the emperor, his wife, Pettenpipa, started home with the emperor. His wife, Pettenpipa, started making eyes at Klee the way she should only be making eyes at Portenchipa. Klee was no fool. He knew what Pettenpipa Pippa was up to, so he warned her with the warning his mother always used. He said, "If you don't stop making eyes like that, they are going to get stuck that way." But Pippa could not stand to be rejected, so she kept making eyes at Klee, and sure enough, her eyes got stuck. She lied to Portenshipa when he came home that night and told him Klee had dressed up like Portenshipa just to get her to make eyes at him. Portenshipa beat Klee to within a footspan of his life, then threw him into jail. But Quarter did not forget Klee. Klee once again prospered because of his faithful conduct. After the jailer beat Klee to within a half-foot span of his life, he put Klee in charge of all the prisoners. Pat and Pippa could not... Oh, sorry, I have already read that. So the next screen, please. And the jailer put Klee in charge of the emperor's former nephew. And he took care of him, and he was in confinement for some time. Then the emperor's ex-nephew, who was confined in jail, had a terrible time sleeping one night. He tossed and turned all night long. When Klee came to him in the morning and observed him, behold, he was downhearted. And he asked the former emperor's nephew, who was with him in confinement in jail, "Why is your face so sad today?" Then the former nephew said to him, "Are you blind? Just look at my hair. I've got bad-headed, and there is no one to interpret it." He said this because in the kingdom of Feb, bedhead interpretations are used to foretell the future. Oh my god. Then Klee said to him, "Do not interpretations belong to Quarter. Let me study your bedhead, please." Then Klee said to him, "This is the interpretation of your bedhead. This afternoon the emperor will restore you to the position of emperor's nephew and have you released from jail. Now, please do me a kindness by mentioning me to the emperor and get me out of this jail. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of Hua, and even here I have done nothing that they should have put me into jail for." That afternoon the emperor declared that his nephew, who was in jail, should be released and be restored to the position of emperor's nephew. When the emperor was asked what should be done with the guy to whom he, the emperor, has given the nephew status, the emperor said to throw him in jail instead. The emperor's nephew did not remember Klee. In fact, he forgot him. But Quarter did not forget Klee. Now it happened, at the end of 2 full years, that the emperor woke up one morning with bedhead, and his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the interpreters, and the emperor had them study his bedhead, but there was no one who could interpret it to the emperor. Then the emperor's nephew spoke up, saying, "I would make mention today of my own offenses. The emperor was furious with me, and he put me in confinement in the jail. And I woke up one morning with bedhead. Now a Wa'ayath was with me there, a servant of the jailer, and he studied my bedhead, and he did interpret it for me. And it came about that, just as he interpreted for me, so it happened. I was restored to my status as an emperor's nephew." Then the emperor sent and called for Klee, and they hurriedly brought him out of the jail. And when he had shaved himself from head to toe, that is how one was presented to the emperor in those days, and changed his clothes, he came to the emperor. And the emperor said to Klee, "I presume that you can see I have bedhead, and no one here can interpret it. But I have heard it said about you that when you study a bedhead you can interpret it. Klee then answered the emperor, saying, "It is not in me. Interpretations of bedhead belong to Quarter." The emperor said to Klee, "Behold, study my bedhead." Now Klee said to the emperor, "A terrible drought is coming. Terrible drought is coming. It is going to cause skyrocketing inflation and a shortage of war jerkins and feb jerkins. Throw the land into a panic, raise prices and drop interest rates. But not before there is a huge surplus of feb jerkins. Now let the emperor look for a man discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Feb. Let the emperor take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact a fifth of the Feb jerkins of the land of Feb in the time of surplus. Then let them gather all the Feb jerkins of this surplus and store them up, and let them guard it. Sorry guys, I had to take a break. Let's continue reading. Now let the emperor look for a man discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Feb. Let the emperor take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact a fifth of the Feb jerkins of the land of Feb in the time of surplus. Then let them gather all the Feb jerkins of this surplus and store them up, and let them guard it, and let the surplus become as a reserve for the land during the drought, which will occur in the lands of Wa, and Feb, so that the land may not perish during skyrocketing inflation. The emperor said, "Wow, all that was in my bedhead?" Then he said to his servants, "Can you believe a man like this guy Klee?" So the emperor said to Klee, "Since you've got all the answers, you shall be over my house, and according to your command all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you. See, I have set you over all the land of Feb." Then the emperor took off his shorts. He had, and we will get to know that right now. He had undershorts on underneath for crying out loud, and put them on Klee. And he had him ride on his second vehicle, and the servants proclaimed before him, "Bow the knee," and he set him over all the land of Feb. Moreover, the emperor said to Klee, "Though I am the emperor, yet without your permission no one shall raise his hand or foot or left eyebrow in all the land of Feb." And he gave him Grail, the daughter of a guy he beat in a game of wagon hurling the previous day. Thus, Klee became prime minister of the neighboring kingdom of Feb. After the period of surplus in Feb, Fez land dried up, and the Fwaherds wandered away, and a shortage of war jerkins threw the land of Fwa into a panic, raising prices and dropping interest rates. The fair boys, Clow, Clough, Claw, Klimt, Cleft, Kleck, Clink, and 5 sons, all of whom fair named Kloppenhomewinwitz, because Fair could not think of another name until the birth of his last son Klee, were forced to trek out to Feb and trade their prized chopper metal statues for Feb jerkins, dreading the odious Feb aftertaste. The Fwa hate Feb jerkins, to them they are dirty. The Fwa are so conditioned to despise Feb jerkins that just thinking of the Feb aftertaste causes a physical reaction. Simply seeing a Feb jerkin has been known to cause a Fwa to go pale and become woozy. The odor of Feb jerkins sets off the gag reflex. it is common to hear a foie gentleman say, "I'd rather eat the refuse of my worst enemy than eat Feb Jerkins." To which another might respond, "Oh yeah, I'd rather poke myself in the eyes with 6-inch rusty spikes than eat a lousy Feb Jerkin." To which another might reply, "Well, I'd rather eat my own head innards after they'd been sucked out through my eye sockets by a great naturally occurring vacuum than eat Feb Jerkins." Still another might say, "I'd rather have a full body massage from a servant girl named Hella than eat Feb Jerkins." To which everyone would respond, "Huh?" If a foie wants to insult another foie, a popular saying is, "Your mother eats Feb Jerkins." It is considered very naughty behavior for foie youngsters to even talk about Feb Jerkins. The controversial foie comedian Louis Kincaid once performed an entire live routine of nothing but Feb Jerkin jokes. Of course, it was an adults-only performance and was banned in most towns. All the people of Foix, including Fair and his sons, realized they would have to choke down the Feb Jerkins and most likely vomit a few times after eating the first 3 or 4, or face certain starvation. Now, Clee was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Clee's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. When Clee... What? Someone is riding a motorcycle here. When Clee saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them with cotton in his cheeks. His brothers ordered 12.5 cases of Feb Jerkins. Then Clee gave orders to fill the cases with shorts of great value, and thus it was done for them. So the brothers loaded their foie oxen with the 12.5 cases and departed from there. At the border, Clee had his police stop his brothers. The head policeman said, "May I see your receipt, please?" Chloe, the eldest, handed over the receipt to the officer. "Says here you bought 12.5 cases of Feb Jerkins. Mind if we take a look inside these here cases?" Chloe agreed to let the police search the cases. When these were opened, the police, of course, found the priceless shorts. The brothers were stunned, to say the least. Their hearts sank, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, "What's up with that?" So the police escorted the sons of Fair back to Clee's house. The brothers thought they were done for, but when Clee saw them, he invited them in and fed them delicious snacks prepared with Feb Jerkins, of course. While they were eating, next slide please. While they were eating, after having thrown up at least twice each, Clee had their cases of Feb Jerkins filled with the finest Feb shoelaces, such as only the Emperor's family would wear. After dinner, Clee released his brothers, who still did not recognize him, to go on their way home. At the border, Clee had his police stop his brothers. What is happening outside? It sounds like someone is abandoning. I cannot speak. It sounds like someone is abandoning their children. That's it. Sorry for the stop. At the border, Clee had his police stop his brothers. The head policeman said, "May I see your receipt, please?" Claw, the eldest, handed over the receipt to the officer. "Says here you bought 12.5 cases of Feb Jerkins. Mind if we take a look inside these here cases?" Claw agreed to let that's the same again, police search the cases. When these were opened, the police of course found the precious shoelaces. The brothers were stunned, to say the least. Their hearts sank, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is up with that?" So the police escorted the sons of Fa back to Klee's house. The brothers thought they were done for, but when Klee saw them, he invited them in and had them join him in the pool. While they were in the sauna after swimming, he had their cases of Feb jerkins filled with priceless gauges. After they had all dried off, Klee released his brothers, who still did not recognize him, to go on their way home. At the border, it's starting to repeat itself. Blah 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 blah. We've already heard that. The same story again about the policeman finding out what they have in, and the brothers being stunned. And them saying, "What is up with that?" And the police escorting them back. Klee saw them, and he had them come in and watch a play performed in mime in his private home theater. Then he had them spend the night. While they were sleeping, he had their cases of abjerkins filled with humanly fetch, which is a lot like a food. In the morning after breakfast, Klee released his brothers, who still did not recognize him. Is it going to be the same? But Claw, the smartest brother, said, "Before we go, I'd like to look in these cases of Febjerkins." No, it's not going to be the same as the previous 3 cases. When he opened one up, of course he found the fetch. He exclaimed, "What is up with that?" Klee knew he had to let his brothers in on his little deception. Klee said, "I'm Klee." And the brothers responded, "Who?" Then Klee took the cotton balls out of his cheeks and told them the whole story, he said. "It goes like this. When I came out to the plains of Chopin to check up on you, you grabbed me." Oh no, is it going to be "and sue me, blah blah blah." It's the same story we've just read. Yeah, blah 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 blah. What? Klee's brothers went. Okay, after he was sold, Klee's brothers went back to Foix and returned to Feb with their father, Fa, who lived there for only a few years until Quarter eventually smote him with a bolt of energy. In all, the Fa family lived in Feb 410 years. Klee, having become ruler of all the land of Feb, was compelled by his people to change his name to Feini, which means most of which still do not agree. Feini begat Feini, and so the history repeats itself. Who begat what? No, I skipped. Feini begat Feini. Feini begat Feini. Who begat Wani, who begat, and so on, but nonetheless, like many generations before him, Eker sank to Ep every night over his crib, whose Ep is begat by Wani. Like many generations before him, Eker sank to Ep every night over his crib, using the flaps in his back. In the tradition of Fa, Aker show all of the love a good parent should show his offspring. He often stared into Eb's face for hours until his eyes grew dry and tired. Eb was full of kindness and generosity. Taught by Aker and likely nurtured by his grandfather Wani. One day, while Eb and his grandfather were on a long... Next slide, please. Oh, this is barbaric. Were on a long trip to the boneyard, Wani grew ill. Wani asked Eb to stay with him until he returned home to father, for he was afraid. Eb daubed Wani's brow with a cool cloth given to him by Aker. Quarter opened the sky and let Wani enter. This was the first time Eb had seen Quarter, who was far more marvelous than the legends told. Ab grew to be a strong and handsome being, much closer in likeness to Bert than any generation before him. Ab became a mighty leader of other beings who saw that was in favor with Quarter. Just as everybody thought that the whole each generation gets worse thing had finally turned around, Ab's own creation came out looking like a pile of something badly burned, so he named it Uh-uh. Uh-uh was not alive, so it could not beget anything. And that's the end of Bird's history, with Bert picture in the end. Now the next chapter called Numeron. Quarter decided to make a being of greater substance than any of his previous creations. Numeron looks like a pile of cubes. He was obsessed with being sensible and correct in everything. Following the rules to the letter, Numeron rarely did anything on his own without asking Quarter for his explicit directions. Numeron loved his crown and wore it with much pride, perhaps a little too much pride. He made 300 duplications of himself, whom he would boss around all day, every day. These are some of their genealogies. No, I'm not. Sorry, I'm not reading another genealogy. Is the whole chapter of Numeron just going to be about who is the father of whom? They at the beginning it was nice satire. It was really heart touching, but I think then after that they ran out of ideas, but insisted on making this Hall of Records as long as possible, so they just filled it with nonsense. I mean, nowadays ChatGPT could write such a long text, but you have to get in, how's it called? You have to acknowledge that this game was in development in the 90s, or maybe even earlier. Let me look that up. You will perhaps see only a part of my web browser screen. The Neverhood Chronicles, and it was released 1996. Yeah, so it was in like 30 years ago. It was in the development, so no ChatGPT back then. Okay, there is something. Oh, that was just some details in the genealogy. I know the video is probably called I'm reading the whole of records, but I am reading it for the interesting lore parts, because I have never done that actually during my childhood and during my how's that called, teenage, and I thought, or I was convinced that it contains the story of Hoborg at the end, and it is like a parody of Bible, which it is to some extent. But I don't think we need to read everything that is just fill in. I see there are some details. The twin kingdoms of Nambai and Nasak, blah blah blah. They began their own societies. Okay, so here begins the next interesting part, I believe. One year, Numeron lost half of his beings off of a cliff. They were on one of their morning marches when the ground fell out from under one of their leaders. and half of the others followed before Numerian noticed their peril, and was able to convince the rest to turn back. Though 150 beings marched straight off the cliff, not all of these perished. Many were some of Numerian's hardiest creations. The two that were the strongest and came through the fall most intact were Nambai and Nasek the Great. The fall landed Numerian's beings in the trench of Aramus. There, Nambai and Nasek set up kingdoms, the twin kingdoms of Nambai and Nasek. This did not go unnoticed by Numerian. He saw that as soon as the surviving beings thought that they were outside the presence of Numerian, they forgot him and his world. They began their own societies. Numerian observed their wickedness and saw that it was great. Numerian was sorry that he ever made any beings at all. He said to himself, "Not only do I have to keep cracking the whip, so to speak, over these beings night and day, but to top it all off as soon as I'm out of their sight." Next slide. "They forget me. At least I still have 150 to keep under my thumb, and believe me I will. The rest of these I can destroy. I'll cause a catastrophic explosion throughout the trench that will show them." But Numerian saw that Nambai was a blameless creature. Nambai was a righteous king. In fact, he was the only being in the trench of Aramus, that remembered Numerian. They called it the trench of Aramus because of the sweet trees that grow there. The actual name of the trench was Great Canyon of the Ruins of Desolation number 5. Oh, here goes the satire again. He tried and tried for 12.5 years to remind the subjects in his modest little kingdom about the past, but since Numerian would not take the time to make himself known, they would not remember him. His subjects thought Nambai was a fine king, but they would not need his warning. They would not heed his warning that their creator would not tolerate their corruption forever. Nasek the Great, on the other hand, did not think Nambai was a fine king. He considered Nambai and his preaching about Numerian a nuisance. Nasek's kingdom grew every day, filling more and more of the trench. The southern sector extended from the wilderness of Ziniflox along the side of Bizimperit. Then the south side was from the edge of Hapalanch, and the border went westward and went to the fountain of the waters of Neopithum. And the border went down to the edge, and the border went down, blah 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 blah. They really ran out of ideas. And it continued to the side in front. It's about the border. Yeah, it reminds me when in the geography class we learned about the border between Asia and Europe. It was something like this, and we had to learn it by heart. I have not done it till this day. I do not remember. And the border turned direction from to the brook of blah blah. As for the western border, and this was the north border, they drew the border line from the amazing blah 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 blah. Okay, so they are arguing about the border, and from there the border continued. It's just about the border. Okay. Next wall, and from that's the border, still the border. What about here? Okay, so this was Nasek the Great's land according to its borders all around. Finally, his thriving cities were all decadent and vile, but that is what sells. That is what the people want. Thus his kingdom grew, even taking in droves of defectors from the good kingdom of Nambai. Yet, still not content with his great wealth of power, riches, and influence, he coveted the dry, rocky land of the kingdom of Nambai. Nasek plotted a war of conquest against Nambai. Numeran saw all of this and knew that Nambai's number was coming up. So he paid a visit to Nambai to explain the catastrophic explosion. Nambai was alone when Numeran arrived. Numeran wanted to speak with Nambai and his wife, Grace, so Nambai went searching for her. The basement was flooded, so she was not there. She was in the attic, which in the kingdom of Nambai is called an Isathilof. So, Isathilof, preferably. So Nambai found her there, high and dry. They went together to the patio where Numeran addressed them. Nambai, I'm going to blow up this trench with all these wild beings in it, but I don't want to destroy you and Grace, so I want you to build a tree house where you can stay and remain safe during the explosion. Okay, that is the parody of the Great Water. Numeran gave Nambai a blueprint for the tree house and described the exact location of the tree he wanted him to build it in. He also gave him very specific details for the construction of the treehouse. You shall make the treehouse from wood by wood. It shall be a split-level treehouse with an enclosed foyer, and so on and so on and so on. As Nambai and Grace worked on the treehouse, their neighbors, who formerly thought of Nambai as a fine king, came out to mock the construction of the treehouse. Numeran had given Nambai 7 days to complete the construction of the treehouse, and he was nearly finished. By then, Nasek the Great had completed his plans for conquest, and his armies were massed and marching towards the capital of Nambai. Then King Nambai and Grace entered the treehouse as instructed by Numeran. Numeran detonated the catastrophic explosion, destroying all the beings, but Nambai and Grace in the twin kingdoms of Nambai and Nasek the Great in the trench of Armos. Now this great explosion had disrupted the deep panels of the world. A hot green substance belched forth from the cracks in the panels and filled the canyon. Nambai and Grace watched as the hot green swirled around the foot of the tree. They were trapped. Now, wood by wood is impossible to burn, so they were safe as long as they did not leave the treehouse. Many days passed as Nambai and Grace grew hungry. One evening they looked out beyond the tree and sang a song to Numeran regarding their hunger. Numeran, send us food to Chumeran. Numeran heard their plea, and he sent a great bird to nest in the tree in which the treehouse was built. Every morning the great bird laid a giant egg which landed in Nambai and Grace's bed. They gently cracked the eggs open to find 5-course meals prepared, complete with a fine linen tablecloth and brass candelabra. That's just the American version of Czech Cinderella. They lived this way for many days until the hot green cooled to become just green. This new form of ground felt lovely to walk on. They lived happily for many ages. Grace died one sorry for that. Grace died one beautiful day. Nambai died 3 days later. Okay. The next chapter, Ottoborg. Ottoborg. Quarter made a king named Ottoborg, designed to be happy and full of joy all day. Robots were a subject that Ottoborg had done a lot of research on, so it was only natural that he made 3 robots to help him make 7 little houses. I have to put my lights on. The robots' names were P, Toger, and Bill. Oh, and the robot Bill is meetable in game. We are getting there. We are slowly getting there. Epi was good at digging, Bill was good at building, and Togar was good at painting. That is why it is said today that if anyone is a good painter, he is Togar. In a very careless way, Ottoborg made 7 boys to live in his new houses. The boys' names were Hypen, Nupen, Petre, oh my friend, Alfonso, Willie Trombone, also a character we've already met, Aloal, so it is lore. Now starts the lore interesting part. The next boy was called Duradius Hapsicum, whose nickname was Creaker, Hondo, and Ed. Ottoborg's sons were easily identified by the loop formed on the top of each of their heads. Sometimes, when they walked along, they would hook their head hoops on branches and hang there for days. Petr, or Petri was so tired of getting his head hooked onto things that he cut his own head off, which proved to be fatal. Ottoborg had forgotten to hold his world together with gravity, so one day his world fell apart in chunks and his 7 sons and 3 robots floated aimlessly across creation. Hypen's chunk of land got caught in the tail of the comet Pyra-George, named Pyra-George because it decreased in size during each orbit. The tail of Pyra-George was full of seeds because the comet once passed through the atmosphere of the planet Burpee. Hypen cultivated his chunk so that he could grow flowers. He loved flowers and how happy and festive they can make a place. Often he would make a wreath of some of the flowers to decorate the loop in his head. Since he was the only one of his brothers with a nose, it seemed especially fitting that this is where Hypen Nupen's chunk of land should be. He grew an extraordinary amount of flowers, but after a few years it was not enough to satisfy his growing craving for flowers. His deepest burning desire was to be king of flowers, to have no rival in growing flowers. He actually did not know of anyone else who was growing flowers, but his unfettered imagination went wild, and he thought that there must be others who were cultivating and growing huge fields of flowers on the many planets and worlds he passed. Year after year, Hypen worked the soil of his chunk of land to try and get it to produce more and more flowers. He developed fertilizers and plant foods. He grew nothing but flowers, though there were plenty of other types of seeds he could have planted. If he did notice some other type of plant growing amongst these flowers, he violently ripped it from the ground, cursing it and tearing it to shreds, then throwing it onto his compost pile. It was so upsetting to him that he would have to lie down for a nap afterwards, but no matter how many flowers the land produced, it was never enough for Hypen. It almost seemed that a chunk of land was desperately trying to please its obsessed master, straining itself year in, year out to produce more flowers than it had the previous season. For many centuries, in fact, it did outperform itself. Each year, a dozen or so more flowers were produced, and Hypen would ask, "Is that all?" Then the yield began to decrease. The land was simply overworked and it needed to rest. Hypen reacted by pressing the land harder and harder to yield more. He was aggravated to no end. The more he did to increase the yield of flowers, the less the land was able to produce. Eventually, as each season went by, the yield decreased first 10, then 100-fold, and so on. Most of the land lay barren and still. If Hypen found anything other than a flower growing, he would pull it up by the roots and throw it into the compost pile. As the land grew grey and sterile, Hypen wasted away also. The loop on the top of his head drooped like a deflated tire. His desire to make his chunk of land a happier place with flowers has died. He spent his last days worrying and hovering over the last few flowers that struggled desperately to grow to maturity in the dust. Is this an allegation for Czech education system? He could not afford the time it took to weed the desolate fields, but only a few spindly vines grew here and there in the depleted soil anyway. When the last flower died, so did Hypen Neupen. And that's the end of Hypen Neupen, but Otto Borg had more sons. Willie Trombone. That's the person that was talking to us through the cassettes. Willie's chunk of land flew off into space, with Willie still inside his little red-roofed house. We will visit that house, by the way. Otto Borg never saw Willie again. What Otto Borg did not know, which this wall does, was that Willie's chunk of land drifted into the most dangerous part of space. You see, there were these nasty creatures called victoids that flew about looking for food. Victoids had a giant nasty mouth, full of giant nasty fangs, and of course the hair that they were covered with was nasty. Anyway, 4 victoids stumbled upon poor Willie Trombone, who was alone just floating through space for quite some time. Sorry for that. Willie, being the friendly type, held out a friendly hand and beckoned them. "Hey, hairy friends!" The victoids screamed with glee when they saw Willie's yellow supple flesh. They figured that he was not a fool and that they would have to trick him before they could eat him. They were wrong, for Willie Trombone was a fool above all other fools, and all of the time that they spent trying to trick him only gave the drifting giant Big Robot Bill enough time to arrive. Bill reached out with his mighty 3 arms and grabbed the floating chunk of land and hoisted himself up. Bill grew horrified as he saw his creator's son about to be devoured by vicious victoids. That evening, Willie Trombone dined on victoids, saving their pelts to use as blankets on especially cold evenings. Willie and Bill became close friends, and they enjoyed each other's company for a long time floating in space. Until one day they saw something very far away, something like a being in distress. By the way, I just make a short pause here. It's so soothing. I would so like to just float in space without the need to eat, drink or something with my friend. It has to be so calming, no compulsory things, no duties and so on. Anyway, Loal kept a journal after Otto Borg's world broke into chunks. Here is copied the only known surviving excerpt from the diary. Only known. So this wall is supposed to know everything, but okay. My chunk of land has whooshed through a mysterious cloud of blue gas. That's Proleoxyla. The cloud is larger than some worlds that I have seen. I made a spur of the moment decision to jump off of the chunk and onto the gas. There is such a cluster of junk on the outer surface of the blue glass. There is such a clutter of junk on the outer surface of the blue gas that it is virtually solid, yet kind of springy. Wow, am I tired! I think I will lay myself down to take a snooze on the junk that clutters the surface of this blue gas, for I have not slept since before Ottoborg's world fell apart. I do not know how long I was sleeping, but I woke up because I felt something tiny and creepy crawling on my knee. I reached down and swatted it with my hand. There was just a yellow spot of goop when I brought my hand up to see what kind of bug it was. Then I heard the weirdest whiny moaning noise I have ever heard. I looked up and around and behind me, but I did not see anything. Then I looked down on the ground. I found myself surrounded by very little beings. Some were laying down. I guess they must have fainted after seeing one of their own squashed by my big hand. I knew they were not bugs because they were all staring at me. And because they were not all crawling over me, or biting me, or injecting their eggs under my skin to incubate there and hatch later. These are very teeny tiny beings indeed. When I compare them to myself, the tallest is only as big as my thumb. Each tiny being has a great head in comparison to the rest of its body. In fact, the heads take up as much space as the body. The two remarkable creatures of the head are the size of the head compared to the little body, and its almost perfect roundness. It is like a melon on a sliver. Each being's head has a mouth, but other than that, there is only one other facial feature. Their globe heads are divided into an upper and lower hemisphere by a dark line at the equator. I think that we will meet these creatures also. I perceive this dark line to be called... what? I perceive this dark line to be, all in one, the eyes, ears, and nose of these beings, since they employed them much in their observation of myself and, with their mouths also, in communication with each other. I was very hungry, as I had travelled on my chunk of land for 40 days and 40 nights or something like that. My first thought was to eat a handful of the little beings, but they held up their hands to ward me off and wailed in high-pitched whiny shrieks. The little beings understood that I was famished from the disgusting rumbling noises that my stomach made, seemingly from thin air. They produced tiny, delicate green crystals in great abundance. In my hand they appeared as so many granules of green sugar, except not gritty. Rather, these were gummy, and had a flavor that made me think green thoughts. As fast as I would pop a handful of the green stuff into my mouth, the little beings would bring me more. They also brought me a cup, though to them it would be a tub or green liquid, which after I drank it, I perceived it to be wine made from the green gummy crystals. It had a very fine flavor, and it made me think rather mellow green thoughts. As much as the big heads, my name for them, speak to me, I never comprehend a single word they say, but I must help them drink their wine. One tiny being, who does most of the talking, seems to be in charge, since the others are always paying attention to him, and they jump to action after he speaks. I suppose he is the father of these tiny beings. While he was speaking, he also did strange dances. He looked really stupid, waving his arms about like that. After a few weeks of the father trying to talk to me, some others of these big heads dressed in tight, colorful clothing came to bother me. Some rode upon wheelie thing. Oh no! Around and around inside the loop on my head. Oh no, uh, yeah, perhaps we will meet them. I wonder. I'm interested in seeing these creatures once again to compare them to what they stayed here as a description. One had the nerve to bounce up and down on my lips. Oh, and I will back up my sound file. One had the nerve to bounce up and down my lips. I should have just opened my mouth and swallowed him whole. The only thing I did not really mind was the three beings that did flips and somersaults on the three spikes that stick out of my chest. That was kind of fun. Days and days of the same thing now, eating green gummy crystals, drinking green wine, watching the father guy, my name for him, flail about like he does and listening to his high-pitched whining. Usually I just sit and smile at him, but when my cheeks get sore, I imitate whatever he is do. Oh, so so he was the giant. Uh, he was the giant. Okay, one of the Ottoborg's sons. Who are we? I'm sorry. I will just have a look back because I forgot I forgot who is the storyteller of this short thing. Oh, it's Alohal. Aloal, who's the smiling giant from the beginning. So it's all things are interconnected if you've seen the film The Great Water. Okay, so he did not swallow them, and sometimes if he nods, I nod. If he shakes his head, I shake mine. I will not write in this diary unless something weird or exciting happens. How long have I been here? It is very hard to keep track of time when nothing new happens. Once again, the father guy came out to bother me with his high-pitched whining, although it seemed more fevered this time. He kept pointing off away from where we sat. Then he stood up and stomped about, always pointing. It looked like a dance to me. As far as I knew, it was a dance, since I had never seen any of these little beings dance, so I stood up and danced. I tried to make the steps of my dance like the father guy's, but he was not at all pleased with my imitation. I was busy trying to perfect my dancing step when I was suddenly hit from all sides by food. I assumed that it was my part in this strange dance to try and catch as much of the food as I could in my mouth. I was doing pretty well, if I do say so myself. I suppose I have an advantage over the little beings since my mouth is so much bigger than any of theirs. Perhaps this is why I was chosen for this special part of the dance. More of the big hats joined the crowd that was throwing the food at me, so that I finally could not keep up with the torrent of food. I do not mean to criticize, but many of the beings did not have very good aim. I was ducking and jumping, doing my best to get my face into place to catch the food, but a lot of it just splattered against my body. A lot more just landed on the ground, so that I stepped in a bunch of it as I moved around. And still, more of the big hats came out to where we all were, and they joined in the food throwing. I felt a little ridiculous since I could not possibly keep up the pace of the dance, and the little guys really showed no sign of letting up. By now, a big circle of the beings surrounded me, all of them whining and shrieking some chant, I suppose. I decided to step out of the circle and figured I would get another chance to get this dance right sometime later. Getting tired. But even after I stepped out of the circle, they continued to throw the food at me. I did not even try to catch it. I really wanted to practice this dance and try to do better the next time. As I stepped further away to get out of their throwing range, they finally stopped. They stopped their whining and shrieking chant too. And soon the big heads were cheering and clapping. I turned back to accept. Oh, so for him they were all the same. I accepted their applause. I think they appreciated that I tried so hard to catch all of the food, because as soon as I turned back, they started throwing more. I did not want to dance this food catching dance anymore. I turned my back to the big hats with big round heads and walked away as fast as I could. Before I knew it, I was walking up to another group of tiny beings. These beings remained silent as I approached. No whining or so I was mistaken. He did see the difference by their reaction only. No whining or shrieking or moaning. These beings are just as tiny as the first beings. I'm very sorry for that. As the first beings I lived amongst, but they have different heads. Their heads seem to be the right size for their little bodies. Their faces are featureless except for a long needle-like proboscis, maybe. These tiny beings seem to use this protuberance for all their communication and all their senses: sight, smell, taste, hearing, feeling. Some of these beings pointed their needle noses here and there over my body as I approached, but most kept them pointed at my feet. Just before I stepped up in front of the needle noses, my name for them, they began clapping. By the time I actually stopped, they were cheering and whooping and jumping up and down. This went on for quite a while. Then they began to quiet down and wrong list, and a crowd began to split down the middle. I noticed one needle nose come in through the crowd to stand in front of me. This needle nose seemed to have the respect of all the other needle noses, because they all gave their attention to him as he stood in front of me. I could tell because all their needle-like noses were pointed at him instead of me. He must be their father guy. After looking me over for a while, the father guy started speaking at me. I did not understand anything that he said to me, but I smiled at him the entire time that he spoke to me. I kept smiling at them all. Oh no, the wrong list again. I kept smiling at them all after the father guy finished. I was trying to think of something to do. I decided to say something back to them. Well, it's really nice, I said, for all of you to come out to greet me today, you know? I couldn't stand for any more of that food throwing dance that the big heads do. You don't have a food throwing dance, do you? Do you guys understand me? I smiled some more, and after I finished, I waited for something to happen. All the needle noses did was turn around and walk away. They kept looking over their shoulders as they left, but they did not seem to care if I followed or if I stayed where I was. I decided I might as well stay where I was. I sat down and waited to see what would happen. For days and days I sat there. For days and days I sat there and nothing happened. At first the needle noses kept looking over their shoulders at me, but after a few days they seemed to forget I was there. After a week or so of being ignored, I was hungry, so I followed some of the needle noses around as they went about their daily chores, and every so often they would look over their shoulders at me. Mostly what they did all day was spit on the ground. It was a disgusting sight. They would form lines and walk through the fields and the spit on the ground day after day. All the time spitting. Day after day, no matter where I was, no matter what I observed them do, they were always spitting. I do not know why I did not notice it before. Then I noticed all their food came from the fields they had been spitting in all this time. Food from spit. Now that they were harvesting, they had time to notice me. Is this like an allegory for humans utilizing bees? For the first time since I arrived in the Needle-Nose land, they offered me food. How could I accept it after seeing them spit all the time to produce the food? I ran away, sickened to my stomach. After what I'm sure must be something like 100 years, I could not take living among any of these tiny beings anymore. I was being starved by the needle-noses, and I did not want to go back to the big heads to have them throw more food at me during their crazy dance. I felt defeated and hung my head in dejection. Now, since I was standing on a cloud of blue gas, as the gas swirled and spun, I could often see through the gas, or at least deep into the center of it. Something fuzzy, as if in the distance on the other side of the cloud, caught my eye. The shape grew larger and a little more defined as it came close. Next slide. All at once I clapped my hands and whooped for joy. I did not need a crystal clear view of the object to recognize it as the very chunk of land that had broken off of Ottoborg's world and brought me to this miserable place. At once I realized what was happening. The chunk of land was caught in a circular orbit, and the blue gas must be going in a straight line that took it through 2 points in that circle. I cried out, "For sure, I am the luckiest of all of Ottoborg's sons!" Carefully, as it passed through the cloud of blue gas, I jumped off the springy surface of debris and onto my chunk of my father's world. I have not been on the chunk of land for about 3 minutes, long enough to make this latest entry into my journal. Gee, it's great to be back home again. I hope I never... Here the excerpt of the diary ends abruptly. It is said that the chunk of land that Elohal was on suddenly smashed into a dirt clot that collided with it head-on. Both the chunk and the clot were traveling at great speeds upon impact. Nothing was ever seen of Elohal again. Creaker's chunk of land was the biggest, and it was full of lakes. There was actually more land covered by water than not. Creaker survived many centuries on the chunk, long enough to learn how to create and build giant replicas of spoons and butter knives. Enormous buckets filled with oversized sesame seeds and huge loaves of bread, among other things. Creaker used the soil of the dry land on his chunk as the material for his sculptures. Whenever he would get tired of looking at one of his colossal sculptures, he would just throw it into a lake. Each of the colossal sculptures displaced enormous amounts of water, covering up a little more dry land each time one was thrown into a lake. When he was not sculpting, Creaker would be out scrutinizing one of his previous sculptures. He was very critical of his work. He always concluded that the sculpture did not communicate the concept that was the impetus behind the work, or he saw a hair or a bug sticking out of the clay. In any case, he was always frustrated. None of his works seemed to express his vision just the right way. He could not quite put his finger on the problem, but his general feeling was that it had to do with the size of the sculpture. If only it was a little bit bigger, he would often say to himself. Then he would leave the thing into the nearest lake. His mind was focused intently on making each new sculpture larger than the previous one, whether it be a giant replica of a rat, pot, bulb, or a mostly empty jar that had been sitting in the back of a valley for 8 weeks. Eventually, he spent very little time examining his finished works, but with an exclamation of disgust, he would throw the work into the nearest lake, which after a while seemed to be conveniently closer and closer, just as soon as it was done, and immediately start on the next one. The replicas were by this time so large that he had to climb them to work on the upper parts. It sounds like he created something in the Neverhood, but, well, we will see. I don't think he manages to come to the Neverhood. The largest sculpture Krieger ever completed was of a baby's arm holding an apple. It was such a titanic work that he had to use spikes and ropes to get up it. When he finished, he had to rappel down the back of the arm. He backed up to get a good look at it, but could not back up very far since he was on a beach. Again, his disgust and frustration overcame him as he said, "No, no, no, that's not it at all." Then Krieger rushed at the base of the sculpture to push it into the water. He barely budged it, but it was top-heavy since the apple at the top was enormous, so that his push was enough motion to cause the sculpture to fall over. Krieger turned to start on a new sculpture. He had in mind a great pair of tongs digging into a bucket of sand, and he never saw the tidal wave that flew upon him. Hondo's flew upon him. That's the end of Krieger's chunk. A Hondo's chunk of land ended up on the back of a giant animal that lived in a desert on an undocumented planet. Hondo seemed to like the animal enough, and he was so small that the animal did not detect his existence. There was not much that Hondo could tell about what the animal looked like. It was a colossal beast compared to Hondo. He took many survey journeys that went on for days and days across the top of the beast to see if it looked different from other locations. As he walked, he noticed the color of the ground change. Presently, he would be passing over an area that was brown, then 15 feet or so further he would pass over an area that was yellow. The surface he walked on was hard and mostly smooth, but it was terraced into short, flat little hills all over. When he came to the edge, he was looking round and he almost fell off. He got down on his stomach to look over the edge. There was nothing between him and the ground, which was very far away. If he had jumped, the fall would have broken every bone in his body. He was on the lip of an overhang, and he reached under it to see if he could feel how far back it went. But the overhang went straight back and kept going. Then he carefully lowered his head over to look and see how far back this overhang went. He could not see it though. There was so much dark shadow he could only see about as far as his hand reached. Hondo got up and decided to walk directly away from the edge. He grew very tired almost immediately as the surface began ascending. Right away it took a day to reach the summit, so he slept there. In the morning, Hondo was able to see very far from the top of the animal. The sky was all blue and the land was all baked. He saw that the highest hilly part of this animal sloped down in all directions around from where he stood. That's everything to Hondo's chunk, and Ed's chunk just spun in place forever. Okay, this is probably Ottoborg. Then there is Homan. Quarter made Homan and gave him 2 crowns and let him decide what to do with the extra one. Homan had a son named Pinto Bunnyman, or Bunnyman, to whom he immediately gave his 2nd crown. Pinto Bunnyman helped Homan with all that he did. Homan made a bunch of beings called Uns. The Uns were blue and looked like little bugs. The blue Uns spent their first day of existence fashioning small spears. Soon the Uns had broken up into small communities. Each community had a specific task to accomplish, which helped all of the other Int communities. Blue Int South was in charge of growing food. Blue Int North built housing for other communities, and so on and so forth. All was peaceful and working efficiently, so Pinto Bunnyman made some Unts of his own, only his were white. Now it came about, when the white Ints began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of the blue Ints saw that the daughters of the white Ints were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. The Hutsamutsa were in the world in those days, and also afterward when the sons of blue Ints came into the daughters of white Ints. What is this word placement? The Hutsamutsa were in the world in those days, and also afterward when the sons of blue Ints came into the daughters of white Ints, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty Ints who were of old Ints of renown. The white Ints instantly mingled with the blue Ints, but they refused to acknowledge the community system of the blue Ints. The white Ints enjoyed the fruits of all the blue Ints' hard work, but did not help them work at all. It only took one white Int to throw an egg at a blue Int one morning, to cause a dreadful feud. So, it's not called, it's called Hemhemhema of the blue Ints rose with all the blue Ints of war to go up to white Int East, and Hemhemhema chose 30,000 blue Ints, valiant warriors, and sent them out at night, and he commanded them, saying, "See, you are going to ambush the city from behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you be ready. Then I and all the blue Ints who are with me will approach the city, and it will come about when they come out to meet us as at the first, that we will flee before them, and they will come out after us until we have drawn them away from the city, for they will say they are fleeing before us as at the first. So we will flee before them, and you shall rise from your ambush and take possession of the city. And then it will be when you have seized the city that you shall set the city on fire. See, I have commanded you." Most of those Ints of war in attendance could not understand Hemhemhema, for the language he used was flowery and outdated. Still, few in attendance there from among all of those in attendance did hearken and understand. Even did they recon the sayings of Hemhemhema, and straightway did they clue in their bodies, who were just lollygagging about, scratching their heads. At once, all who heard this explanation did understand Hemhemhema's plan, so Hemhemhema sent them away, and they went to the place of ambush, and remained between the white Unt west and white Unt east, and the west side of white Unt east, but Hemhemhema spent that night in the wagon leisure inn. Now Hem arose early in the morning and mustered the Blue Inns, and he went up with the elders of Blue Inn before the Blue Inns to White Inn East. Then all the Blue Inns of war who were with him went up and drew near and arrived in front of the city and camped on the north side of White Inn East. Now there was a valley between him and White Inn East, and he took about 5,000 Blue Inns and set them in ambush between White Inn West and White Inn East on the west side of the city. So they stationed the Blue Inns, all the army that was on the north side of the city and its rear guard on the west side of the city, and Hemma spent that night in Sid's garden spot. Is this going to lodge? And it came about when the king of blah 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 is going to be all the it's another fill-in slide, but they performed exactly what Hemma said. Okay, and were successful. And then Homan said to Hemma, "Stretch out the spear that is in your hand toward White Inn East, for I will give it into your hand." So Hemma stretched blah blah blah, and then men in ambush rose. Okay, so it's again about the things that have nothing to do with the lore of this game. I know that I am kind of cheating by skipping. I am very aware of that, but I am reading this text because I am curious about this game's lore and how is everything we can meet in this game mentioned in the text on the wall of this hallway. But this was just there's an animation glitch. Oh no, my monitor is just dirty. Okay, but I'm interested only in the story that is connected towards the game. This has nothing to do with the game. But finally, something connected with the game. One of the sons of the guy who we will actually meet in this game in person is called Hoborg. Quarter wanted to see what would happen if he made a creative being with a big heart. Quarter named him Hoborg, meaning big heart. Hoborg was given a crown and he set out into a void of clouds as Quarter watched him from a distance. Hoborg liked the idea of making a place for some beings of his own. He knew that the clouds that swirled around him would make a perfect sky, so he just needed to make some land. One thing that concerned Hoborg was that perhaps some of his beings would come out bad. He wanted to make beings which he could enjoy forever, but he did not want to force them to love and respect him. He decided that he would make his beings with the ability to choose right and wrong. Working everything out in his head, he figured he could make one child at a time and see if he turned out good before he started on the next. Hoborg made a tiny scale model of his world in clay to see if it looked the way he had imagined it. He spent about 20 years designing the shapes and colors of this place, which he would call the Overhood. He needed some clay to make his world, and the only place where clay could be found that was of the purity and quality Hoborg wanted would take 400 years to reach. He was so anxious to get started that he asked for help from Quarter. Quarter, thank you for making me with such a fine crown. Everything in life is just wonderful, but I was wondering. Hoborg got down on one knee. Can you help get me to the clay of highest quality? Quarter laughed. That would take even me a long time to reach. What's wrong with the clay that I have already given you? Holberg answered. I like the clay you gave me for planning things, but I was hoping for the best ingredients for my beings. You see, I want them to last forever, and clay only lasts for a few thousand years. Quarter was impressed. Here is a scope that will help you see as far as you need to. You will be able to pick the shortest path to the clay, which should save you quite a few years of travel. Holberg received the scope. Oh, thank you, Quarter. You are very generous. Holberg started on his journey that same day. Looking through the scope, he could clearly see the mountain of clay he needed to build the Neverhood. Every day was the same. Holberg awoke before sunrise so that he could travel far without heat. But before he set off to travel each morning, he thought lofty, respectful thoughts about Quarter. Holberg, in his ever so deep voice, would sing songs to the ground about how good it was to have been made. After a morning's journey, Holberg would cover himself up in soil and rest. He resumed his mission in the afternoon and walked toward the great mountain of clay until late in the evening. After 20 years of travel, Holberg grew very lonely. Soon he could not stand to go on. He found a chunk of land upon which he could stop and rest. It had one spindly vine growing on it, and Holberg lay down beside it to enjoy the shade it provided so he might be delivered from his discomfort. And Holberg was extremely happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day a worm came and attacked the plant, and it withered. And it came about when the sun came up. Then a scorching east wind, and the white light of the sun beat down on Holberg's head, so that he became faint and begged to die, saying, "Death is better to me than life." Holberg could not get himself to do anything. He just lay there. Holberg began to scrape, absent-mindedly, at the dirt where his land lay. Then he said, "Scraping is better to me than death." It was a fine, dry dirt that was packed down and baked hard by the white sun. His fingers bent, lifted, and stretched. Bent, lifted, and stretched, bent, lifted, and stretched, scratching relentlessly. His fingers scraped through the layers of fine dust and grit day after day. Just a few grains of dust and grit required weeks of scraping before it broke loose from the ground. The ground was dead hard and compacted, more and more dirt added to the pile under his palm each month. During the years that passed, the only sounds he heard were the scraping of his hand on the dirt and his breathing. After a pile big enough to pick up formed under his hand, he grabbed it, spat on it, and squeezed it, and squeezed it, and squeezed it, until his hand turned white and his knuckles made popping noises. Holberg sat and looked at what lay in his palm as he opened his fist. He saw that he had formed a clot of dirt. Now the worm that had attacked the spindly vine and caused it to wither popped his head out of the ground and admired the clot, saying, "My, what a nice clot of dirt you've got there." Looking Holberg up and down, it asked, "Did you make that all by yourself?" "Yes, I did." "If I were you," said the worm, "I'd stay right here and make more dirt clots. You could fashion them into beings and populate this chunk of land with them. After all, did you really see a pile of clay through the scope Quarter gave you? Or did you just want to see it because Quarter said you would be able to see it?" Holberg answered, "Actually, Quarter said the scope would enable me to see the shortest path to the clay, and because of that, I should save quite a few years of travel. But I've been traveling for so long. And the worm said to Hoberg, You haven't saved any time in your journey. You haven't ever seen clay, have you? I wonder if Quarter has ever seen clay. When Hoberg thought of it that way, he also began to wonder. Was there even such a thing as clay? This is clearly a reference to Bible again. He had only heard about it. He'd never seen any. Then a thought occurred to Hoberg. Sure, it had taken many years to collect enough dirt to make this one cloth, but he had plenty of time, and he knew there was plenty of dirt right here. He did not have to keep searching for clay, or he could continue his journey, not even knowing when or if he would reach his goal. He considered making more dirt cloths and creating cloth being right there to populate the chunk of land he had stopped on to rest. Sure, it would take a lot of spit, but Hoborg figured he would find a way to work up enough, and now that he had a purpose for scraping, he could use both hands and save time. First, he would finish creating a being from the dirt cloth he already had made. Hoberg knelt beside the thing that he had put together. The hideous outrage of dirt stretched out, and then, as he worked the cloth with his hands, it began to show signs of life, and stirred with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful it must have been, for supremely frightful was the effect of his endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of his own creator Quarter. His success terrified Hoberg. He cast away his odious handiwork, horror-stricken as far and with as much velocity as he could throw it. He hoped that, left to itself out wherever it might land, the slight spark of light which had received such imperfect animation would subside into dead matter. Hoberg went to sleep in the belief that the silence of the grave would quench forever the transient existence of the hideous cloth which he had looked upon as the cradle of life. He slept, but in a dream he was awakened. He opened his eyes, beheld the horrid thing standing at his side, under the spindly vine. In Hoberg's dream it grew back, and it looked on him with yellow, spit-oozing but speculative eyes. Hoberg awoke, for real now, and was horror-stricken, because he saw something far away, and it was growing less and less far away with every minute. At first he thought it was the cloth creature coming back to get him, but as it got closer, he could see that it was much bigger than a dirt cloth. A short while passed before Hoberg could make out the shape. It was a piece of land with a little red-roofed house on it. There was a big robot and a little being on it. Hoberg realized that these folks would pass him if he did not act quickly, so he took off his belt from around his waist and made a lasso. He figured that it still was not long enough to reach this passing landmass, so in an act of desperation he gouged a chunk of his chest out and rolled it into a great snake that extended the end of his belt. This contraption was long enough to lasso the land, which halted when the cord went taut. The big robot pointed to Hoberg's chest and said, "Me, Bill. Me, Bill." Hoberg waved and answered, "Me, Hoborg. I'm Hoborg." The smaller being, slightly smaller than Hoberg, by the way, Willie Trombone, but 1/50th the size of Bill, pointed to Hoberg's chest and said, "Me think him's pointing your torso, big ouch." Hoberg had not realized that his guts were oozing out of the large fissure he had created in his chest. "Good Quarter, what am I going to do?" The small being took off his own belt and instructed Bill to carry him down to where Hoberg was. The being jumped into Bill's hand, and he walked over to where Hoberg sat, about to pass out. "Me, Willie," the stranger said as he tied his belt over Hoberg's chest, clamping the severed sections together and closing up the self-inflicted injury. Hoberg placed his hand on Willie's shoulder. "Hello, Willie. I'm Hoberg, and you just saved my life." Willie did not seem to acknowledge this statement. Hoberg figured Willie was not altogether sane, but he was grateful just the same. After a few days of rest, Hoberg decided it was best to continue on his journey. Hoberg asked Bill and Willie if they wanted to join him. Bill just said, "Me, Bill. Me, Bill." And Willie mumbled a bunch of gibberish to himself. Hoberg liked their company, but he figured that they did not want to come along, so he tearfully said goodbye. Hoberg was surprised to find that when he walked, Bill and Willie followed him. Hoberg did not question them, he just grew happy inside and continued toward the clay. Big Robot Bill, Hoberg found out his full name because it was engraved on the back of his foot. It truly is, we will see that at the end of the game. Proved most useful for carrying Willie and Hoberg and the little red-roofed house over canyons too steep to climb. Hoberg noticed, while being carried by Big Robot Bill, that Bill's chest had a switch inside it marked as good at the present setting and bad on the other setting. Hoberg dared not find out what the bad setting did, but he thought it must be a poorly thought out attempt at dealing with the same problems he had when he was planning the making of beings that were capable of doing right and wrong. Within a few more years, the three made it to the clay. It was a mountain of the purest clay in the known universe, and Hoberg found it to be of higher quality than he or even Quarter imagined it would be. He filled his crown up with a few good-sized chunks of clay. Bill and Willie carried a few hunks to help. Altogether, Hoberg figured there was enough to make his overhood and about 2,000 beings. On the way back to where Hoberg had started his journey, a Tigburger came upon the trip to trial. A Tigburger is something all icky and sticky that Quarter always said to run away from. Hoberg yelled for Bill to grab Willie and himself and make a run for it. A Tigburger is made to want what other beings have. He could tell that they had a bunch of clay, so he licked his lips, exposed his fangs, and said, "Clay!" as fast as Bill could run. It was not fast enough to outrun the nimble Tigburger. The ID panel on the back of Bill's foot was removed with one swipe of Tigburger's razor-sharp claw. Hoberg saw that Bill was slowing down and that they would soon perish if they did not do something quick. Hoberg threw all of the spare clay over to the ground below. He figured the amount remaining would still be enough to make a medium-sized world and about 500 beings. The problem was that as soon as Hoberg dumped the clay, Tigburger gobbled it up, and it was still closing in on Bill. Hoberg nervously threw some more clay out, and this time Tigburger ate it, but slowed down considerably. This was not good enough, since Bill also was slowing down considerably from the exhausting pace. He simply could not carry much longer. Hoberg decided that he would have to be happy with about 20 beings in a small neighborhood as a world. With that, he dumped most of his clay over with just a bit left for his greatly reduced plans. It worked this time, since Tigburger stopped completely and could not follow them since he was stuffed with so much clay. Bill continued under Hoberg's guidance holding the little red-roofed house on his shoulder, where Willie and Hobart could ride and room together. After many years' journey, Hobart returned and was ready to build the Neverhood, a neighborhood that would last forever, so long as nothing went wrong. Here we can see the robot Bill and Hobart uh, handing him a bear, I presume. The next chapter is called Arven. Arven is a sleek and fast being who created thousands of beings from the first moment he was given a crown. Besides his crown, there is an aerodynamic fin off the back of his head because he is so fast. His style of creating is fast. Get in, create, get out. He does not keep account of the worlds he creates, nor the beings he creates to inhabit them. Quarter made Arven quiet, serious, lean and efficient. Arven has spoken only once to some of the beings he has created. Quarter wanted to make a being who would fill up the rest of creation with more worlds and planets and beings. Arven does not even take the time to create beings who will be creators themselves. Arven now has 7 worlds that his beings inhabit. Nordo is a world consisting of a group of 7 planets, each with a civilization of its own. The inhabitants of each planet have a distinct mythology, with the common element of the 7 planets fighting amongst each other, but they never do in reality. This makes the various races of the 7 planets fear each other intensely, though there is no real need to do so. The 7 planets are Itsnack, inhabited by the school monkeys, where, by the way, we could have seen a school monkey at the beginning of the game during the intro sequence. It was jumping on the rope and punching against that clay block which represented the castle with the engraving The Neverhood Chronicles. And also School Monkeys is the name of the following game that is the sequel to The Neverhood Chronicles, this game we are playing right now. School monkeys look like monkeys with skulls for heads. School monkeys spend the whole day chasing each other in a nervous, hyperactive way, while school monkeys would love to scare the young of other civilizations. They cannot, for other worlds are not accessible to them. For this reason, transportation research is a primary concern of the smarter school monkeys. Alpha Joe, the leader of the kingdom of the school monkeys, hoped to have a spaceship of some kind built to fly to planets full of yaff to scare. One day, while Alpha Joe busied himself with detailed plans of a great ramp to launch a great rocket, his assistant, Harry Joe, climbed down the great fort and decided to rest at the watering hole. Harry Joe drank deeply from the pure waters and looked at himself in the still reflection. He poked his finger in his auricular foramen and wondered what it would be like to have flesh on his head. "I am very ugly," thought Harry Joe. This was an odd thought, since most school monkeys have no concern for appearances. "For this reason I will cast myself into the water and live no more," he said, then jumped. His body made a loud splash and he felt the cool water touch every part of his body. His hair grew deeply saturated with water until all of the air bubbles wriggled their way up to the surface. Harry Joe exhaled and sank even deeper, far deeper perhaps than any other school monkey had ever gone before. Weightless, he refused to move or struggle. Dark waters surrounded him, and he thought about his yacht. Harry Joe remembered a particularly unpleasant day many years before, when he was just a lad school monkey receiving his lessons from an elder named Lojo. "Many are the hairs on our backs," said Lojo, "and likewise are the number and likewise are the number of, no, not again, of school monkeys in this world." Harry Joe looked up to Lojo as a father figure. For weeks, Harry Joe followed every move Lojo made. If Lojo went into the forest to forage for nuts and grubs, so went Harry Joe. If Lojo tended to his garden, so did Harry Joe. One especially warm and beautiful day Harry Joe was on his way to Lojo's cave when he saw a great crowd gathered round the entrance. Many school monkeys were howling to show their mournful state. Lojo's wife was the gloomiest of all. She was like a brittle fall leaf blown into a corner. Harry Joe pushed his way to the front of the crowd demanding to see his mentor. Lojo gently swung by his neck, hung from a braided piece of cloth his 2 children had made. His children were the first to find him in this state. The peculiar thing that Harry Joe recalled was that he had shaved himself completely naked. Arnott, inhabited by the Rs. Rs observe other planets and civilizations, hoping one day to apply all that they have learned to their own civilization. This is not likely, however, since they find comfort in research and are terrified of application. Rs are extremely advanced in the arts of the mind, which they use to read other beings' minds. Every other generation in the R's lifetime produces an Omega R. Omega R's have such superior mind control that they can use their minds to form physical doorways between worlds. This has been outlawed by Arwen, and only because Quarter brought this to his attention. But the Omega Arts were not stopped until after they had moved a few school monkeys, and even Rs to other planets. Baak, inhabited by half school monkeys who are half blue called blue school monkeys. These beings look just like white since the mating of a school monkey with a blue causes a loss of pigmentation in the offspring, resulting in a blue that appears to be white. There is no other visual effect on the offspring from the school monkeys, though their behavior is more like that of a school monkey than the community-building blue girly, inhabited by proto-school monkeys. These pitiful beings have to bury themselves up to their necks every night in the rich girly soil to keep from dying of dehydration. They can only eat hoe bread, which can only be made by grinding up the largest eggs and adding them to hoe butter before it rises. Arwen corrected all of these limitations in the final design of school monkeys, and so on and so on. This does not add anything towards this world's lore. So let's skip through this and leave it for the people who want to read it. You can always pause the video or find the text somewhere else. But I'm afraid at Arwen we won't see anything referring the Neverhood. So let's skip through the rest of Arwen chapter towards some chapters that are more related to the world of the Neverhood. Because I believe there is supposed to be a whole text about how Neverhood was created. Okay, okay, this is it. This is Arven. Okay, so I guess the whole part of how Hoberg created the Neverhood was described in the Hoberg part. I was thinking that maybe something more could have happened. Okay. Thank you for watching the whole video of me reading these chapters, and in the next episode I will continue with the rest of the gameplay.